Welcome back to the Chess Goals YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to look at this Caro-Kann pawn structure. This was an idea from Bob. He's a Chess Goals VIP member. He said, Matt, can we look at some examples of plans for black out of this Caro-Kann pawn structure? So first, let's break it down to just the king and pawn endgame. In this position, let's ask ourselves, who has the advantage, white or black? I think you have to say that white has just a very slight edge. And the reason for that is if both kings, let's say, march up the board, I'm going to say f4, king f8, king f2, king e7, king e3, right? Get both kings into their optimal positions. We could reach a scenario like this where it's very easy for black to make a small slip up and the white king can advance. Whereas from the white position, it's a lot harder to make a big mistake. So I think in this sort of king and pawn endgame, it's best for black to play actively. So if we go back to this position, let's say f5 by black, creating what looks like a weakness, but it's just a king and pawn endgame. It's not easy to get to that pawn. But black wants to be very active, right? Try to get the king in here, maybe try to expand over here on the king side, get some trades that'll open up a route for the king. That's how black can equalize this king and pawn endgame. But knowing that white has the slight advantage from the start position, that's something that we have to be aware of. We don't want to just trade down all the pieces, reach this king and pawn endgame, and be at risk of losing and have zero chance of winning. So now let's add rooks on the board. How does this look with rooks? We can see the stockfish eval here, 0.00. This is completely equal with rooks. And the reason for that is because if white tries too hard to advance, black can actually tie down the white pawns pretty easily by, for example, doubling on the d file or creating counter threats with the rooks. And the more the pawns come advanced, after a couple pawns trade off, the more those advanced pawns can become targets. So that's something to keep in mind as well. If you can keep the rooks on the board in this type of endgame, that will favor black versus having the rook swapped off, right? Because when you're on the passive side of this type of endgame, you want to have rooks on the board to have some targets to go after. All right, now I have three different games to show you guys based on this pawn structure. Here's the first one. We have a 23.99 playing white, a 25.70 playing black, and this comes out of a Caro-Kann. It's a rapid game from a Spanish championship in 2021. So here we see a two knights attack, where both knights come out, f3 and c3. D takes e, knight takes e4, and knight f6. This is what we recommend in the ChessGoals Caro-Kann course. And after queen e2, knight takes, queen takes, we can see this pawn structure forming. We just need white to play d4, which he does on the next move. Bishop comes out to f5, c3, and e6. So here's this Caro-Kann pawn structure. We know it's a little bit passive for black, right? We don't have any pawns on the 5th rank. White has one pawn on the 4th rank. So that means white has a little bit more space, and we want to fight for that space long term. Usually the ways that we'll fight back against this d4 pawn is we'll look to play either e5 or c5. And I can tell you from experience, c5 is much more common. It's a lot easier to get that c pawn pushed. It's already defended by the bishop. Oftentimes we'll have either the queen here, the rook on c8, or this pawn on b6. All of those support the c5 square. The e5 square is a lot harder for us to control because look at what white already has in this position. Pawn, knight, and queen, all guarding e5. We don't have any pieces defending the e5 break. So c5, much more common. In this game, we're going to look at this kind of interesting kingside fianchetto by white, and we're going to go deep into this pawn structure because I think it's a nice example of how to play this position from the black side. Bishop e4 was played, bishop g2. Now we see an immediate c5. And this is what I'm going to keep talking about time after time in this video. You want to get those pawn breaks in as quickly as you safely can. So in this position, with the bishop coming out to g2, there is no bishop to b5 check. Oftentimes, bishop to b5 check can be the reason why you don't want to play a quick c5, because once this pawn leaves c6, there's no defense to the king. It's not easy to block those checks. In this case, the bishop went to g2. Black gets the quick c5 in. Castle, c takes d, queen takes, and now we shifted into this pawn structure. We have 4 on the king side for black, 3 on the king side for white, 3 queen side for white, 2 queen side for black. This is going to be a very common pawn structure that will come out of the initial pawn structure we looked at. So this pawn structure, very likely to have these 2 pawns trade off. Keep that in mind. When those 2 pawns trade off, black is actually able to try to create a weakness out of this scenario 3 versus 2. So sometimes this is called a minority attack. It's not as often called that a minority attack in this type of pawn structure, but that's essentially what we're going to do. We're going to use our 2 pawns to try to weaken one of white's queenside pawns. So black trades off that set of bishops, gets the king in position, both rooks in the center. And I'm not focusing too much on exactly why black plays the moves that he does, but I just want to show you what can happen coming up. See a6 by black. And look what just happened here. c4 was played. This is a mistake by white. So black hasn't done anything crazy. The position is equal so far. White plays c4. It looks like a nice aggressive move trying to gain space, but that c4 pawn now becomes a target. So typically we need to provoke a weakness on the queen side by playing, for example, b5, b4, getting things to swap off, maybe creating an isolated pawn in the end. But in this case, a 2399 player, a very strong player, played c4 himself, creating his own weakness. So this can definitely happen in our games as well. Rook back to d7. And now watch what black does here in the next couple moves. This bishop retreated to e7. That opened up an attack on the c pawn. White defends it with b3. And now b5. All of a sudden there's a big problem for white. That c pawn is pinned down to the knight. And really the best line for white, according to the engine, is rook takes d7, knight takes d7, and just giving up that pawn completely. B takes c, ignore it, bishop f6. Black has 2 queenside pawns to white's 2, and 1 extra pawn on the e-file. This is a much better position for black, and black is playing for the win already. In the game, white decided to play more actively, c takes b5. And I think he was probably planning this. Give up the knight, try to get these connected pass pawns. So after rook takes, b takes a6, we see 3 passed pawns for white. There's no queenside pawns for black. But look at how quickly black shuts this down. Rook trade, rook takes a2, hitting this pawn, rook d4, and then he just goes and scoops up the pawn. Very easy chess. You might be wondering, what if a7 is played in this position? Let's toggle on the engine and take a look. We got a 3.8 advantage, and knight to d5 is the move, hitting the bishop, which defends the pawn. So white's going to be in trouble here. There's no way to keep this pawn defended. So that's a 3.6 advantage. So rook takes a6 was played, rook c4, and in a couple more moves, white resigned. Black is up a full knight. Pawns are equal, 4 versus 4. Let's go to the next game. So in this one, we're going to get a more standard setup by white. White's rated 2166, black is 2096. This is from a chess.com titled Tuesday, played just last year. So we got a Caro-Kann, kind of a classic knight takes e4 line. And we see a Tartakower declined. In our repertoire, ChessGoals Caro-Kann, we recommend h5, h4, trying to harass that knight. But in this case, we're seeing e6, and now we get to see an example of this bishop trapped behind the Caro-Kann pawn structure, right? That bishop is trapped behind these light squared pawns. So it looks pretty passive so far. Okay, this is all standard. And now we see the full pawn structure that we looked at initially, right? There's white's pawn chain. We have the pawns on c6 and e6. And at this point, black plays c5. Great move. So black got all of the major pieces developed. Got this knight out, got the king castled. These two had to be out for that king to get castled. And now c5 is ready. After bishop to e3, black calmly plays pawn to b6, creating this route for the light square bishop to get out on the long diagonal. This is perfect play by black. B takes c, knight takes c. Now we're back to that pawn structure we talked about. 2 versus 3 on the queen side. We're able to play for a minority attack, create queenside weaknesses in white's camp. Bishop back to c2, bishop b7. White played a4. This is a very common move by white. The reason white tends to play a4 is they have the rook on a1, and they can maybe create some play down the a file themselves. And if they're able to trade a pawn for b pawn, this is a scenario we don't usually want because there is now a passed ski pawn. There's no black pawns to stop that pawn. Try to avoid that scenario. Knight d5 played by black. And here queen to c7 would have been an even better move, and I'll show you why. Black has this idea, bishop to a6, and there's no good square for the white queen. We're going to quickly play rook d8, hitting the queen. So let's say white tries to get the queen to safety. Queen e2, we have bishop a6, skewering the queen to the rook, forcing c4, and then we could play a move like rook a to c8. And now we got this target. We already have this hole sitting on the b4 square. Black's in the driver's seat. Slight advantage for black at this point. So this is a very standard looking position. We're only 13 moves in. Queen c7, black's got the advantage. And the game knight d5 was played, which keeps it closer to equal. Bishop d4, bishop f6. And we see here again, black is okay with some trades in this pawn structure, right? We're going to try to provoke a weakness with the queenside pawns for white. White plays a5. There's a trade on d4. Solid move by black that shuts down this g3 knight and also blocks the bishop on c2. So even though it creates some dark weaknesses, it does a very nice job shutting down any sort of attacking potential from white's side. And these dark squares cannot really be accessed by white at the moment. A takes b6 was played. This is a huge decision, and I just alluded to the fact that we don't want to allow white to have this passed pawn running down the board. Black should capture this with the pawn. A takes b6. This is an advantage again for black. White does not have a great plan because this pawn can't move. It's tied down to c3, and the c pawn doesn't want to move because then it becomes an even larger weakness. The further that pawn advances, the easier it is for us to attack, as we saw in that other position where we played bishop to a6, provoking c4. In the game, knight takes b6 was played. Black went on to win, but it wasn't the cleanest conversion. This actually gave white an advantage at the moment by taking back with the knight. So that's another key takeaway. You want to avoid that c-pawn becoming a pass pawn. All right, we have one last game to look at. This one, we're going to see a possible e5 and c5 break for black. This is another titled Tuesday game. We have a 1900 playing white and a 2000 playing black. Caro-Kann, again, kind of this classic variation, knight c3 in taking back on e4 with the knight. So here's our Caro-Kann pawn structure. Black's developing very smoothly. And here we're going to see something a little bit different. The dark square bishops are going to trade off. And the reason this is important for me to point out is because with this new variation with the dark square bishops trading off, we're actually going to be able to play for e5. Another thing to note is the positioning of these knights. There's no knight sitting on f3 defending e5, right? So after the bishops trade off, the only thing guarding e5 for white is going to be this d pawn. So castle, knight a6, knight d7 was not available because of bishop takes bishop. So that knight comes through c7. We see a trade, knight f4. And at this point, black played bishop takes d3. This is a nice instructive moment. We're at the first point in the game where it makes sense for black to push e5 or c5. If e5 is played, for example, d takes e, queen takes e, and if rook e1, we can move the queen across to, let's say, c5. This is a dead equal position. This is one way to play for the pawn break. You can play for e5, trying to trade the e pawn for the d pawn, and this creates pawn symmetry. We have the exact same pawns lined up if we go for this. So even though e5 is an option, I almost always look to play c5. It's very rare that I'm looking to draw out of the Caro-Kann. This does kind of kill off the winning chances for both sides, but it's a valid option, and sometimes playing e5 maybe could get you an advantage, or maybe you're okay with a draw depending on who your opponent is. In this position, there is also pawn to c5. If d takes c, we take with queen. We get this exact pawn structure we talked about before, 3 versus 2 on the queen side, minority attack chances for black. I hope this video was instructive. This was the Caro-Kann pawn structure. Kind of gave you a few ideas to look for in games, and you can go search for these kind of games yourself. Really, any Caro-Kann classical variations tend to lead to this pawn structure. Tartakower, not as often, but other classical lines tend to lead to this. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.